They dragged her bread basket off the table in front of everyone. Not knocked over, not bumped by accident, dragged deliberately, with two hands by Dorothy Haynes, the boarding house keeper's wife, who smiled while she did it and said, loud enough for the whole market square to hear, "We don't need your kind selling food here, Mabel. Who'd want to eat anything touched by those hands?" Bread hit the dirt, every loaf. And the people standing nearby, some of them regular customers, some of them women Mabel had nodded to for 2 years. Not one of them said a word. Few of them laughed. One turned away. And Mabel stood there, 23 years old, 40 pounds heavier than she'd been before the pregnancy, 3 weeks out from burying a daughter who never drew a full breath. She did not cry. She picked up what she could salvage. She did not look up. That was the morning. Everything was about to change, though she didn't know it yet. This story already has your heart. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like this one, full of fire and grit and the kind of truth that hits harder than fiction. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. Mabel Carter had not always been the woman people pointed at. There was a version of her that existed before the marriage to Thomas Carter, before the pregnancy, before the long months of carrying a child in a body that seemed to be eating itself from the inside out, before the birth that lasted 2 days and ended in silence. That version of Mabel had been plain but capable, the kind of woman who could stretch $1 into a week's worth of meals and still have something left over. She'd grown up in eastern Missouri, the second daughter of a dry goods merchant who never had quite enough and always pretended otherwise. She'd learned early how to work quietly and expect little. Thomas had seemed like solid ground. He was a carpenter, steady with his hands, a man who spoke more in gestures than in words. They'd married in the spring of 1871 and moved west. 6 months later, following a cousin's letter that described Harlan Creek as a town with opportunity, as though opportunity were a thing that simply waited in a place for whoever arrived first. What they found instead was a settlement that had stalled somewhere between ambition and exhaustion, a main street with 3 saloons and 1 church, a handful of businesses that were mostly fronts for gambling or barter, and a social order so rigid it might as well have been carved in stone. Thomas died in the fall of 1872, a beam from an unfinished roof, badly supported, badly warned about. He was gone before the doctor arrived, and Mabel found out she was pregnant 2 weeks after they put him in the ground. She had very little money and no family within 400 miles. What she had was a rented room at Haynes boarding house, a sewing kit, a bread recipe her mother had given her, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has decided she is not going to fall apart no matter how reasonable that option might seem. She started baking at 4 in the morning, selling loaves at the market by 7. In the beginning, people bought from her because the bread was good, dense, and honest, the kind that held up through a working day. She wasn't trying to charm anyone. She set up her basket, named her price, and let the product speak. For a while, that was enough. But the pregnancy changed things. Her body, already softened by grief and irregular eating, expanded in ways that felt outside her control. She ate what she could afford, which was never quite right, and the weight came and didn't leave. By the time she was 7 months along, she'd stopped being Mabel Carter the widow and become, in the language of Harlan Creek, that fat woman at the market. People said it without lowering their voices. Some of them said it to her face, framed as observation, as though they were simply pointing out the weather. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had more important things to think about. The baby came early, on a Tuesday in January, during a sleet storm that sealed every window in the boarding house. A midwife named Ruth Cobb sat with her for 11 hours. The child, a girl, small and bluish, with a shock of dark hair exactly like Thomas's, breathed for perhaps 4 minutes. Mabel held her for 2 hours after, and Ruth sat quietly in the chair by the door and did not try to take the baby away until Mabel was ready. She named her Clara. She buried her in the town cemetery. 3 days later, in ground so frozen it took 2 men most of the morning to dig the hole. 3 people attended: Ruth Cobb, Reverend Marsh, and a woman named Agnes Fowler, who had lost her own child the previous summer and came without being asked. After that, Mabel went back to baking bread. What else was there to do? Her body continued producing milk for weeks, which was its own particular cruelty. She bound herself tight every morning and tried not to think about it. The grief was something she wore on the inside, layered under her work clothes, and she moved through each day with the deliberateness of someone who knows that if she stops moving, she may not start again. The women at the boarding house had never been warm, but after the baby died, they grew sharper. Dorothy Haynes, who owned the place along with her husband, Frank, had a way of making her contempt feel administrative. She'd raise the rent and explain it as a policy change. Or she'd announce at the dinner table that certain rooms were drafty without quite meeting Mabel's eyes. The other boarders, 2 traveling merchants and a schoolteacher named Miss Pryor, took their cues from Dorothy and found various ways to exclude Mabel from their conversations without technically doing anything she could object to. Miss Pryor was the one who said, within earshot, that it was uncomfortable to share a dining table with someone of Mabel's size. That was the word she used. Uncomfortable. As though Mabel's grief and her body were both just aesthetic problems, inconveniences to be managed. Mabel ate in her room after that. She told herself she preferred it. By March, she had developed a routine rigid enough to hold her together. Wake at 4, light the stove, mix the dough, let it rise while she dressed, bake 2 batches, wrap the loaves, carry them to the market in her large flat basket, sell until noon, return, sleep for an hour if she was lucky, spend the afternoon mending clothes for anyone who paid, eat whatever was cheapest, sleep by 9. She did not vary from this. Variation felt dangerous. Variation was what happened when you let yourself notice how alone you were. The market was its own daily ordeal. She had a spot near the end of the row, between a man who sold dried herbs and a woman who brought eggs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The herb seller, Old Vic, was indifferent to her in a way she had come to appreciate. He neither insulted her nor pitied her, just nodded when she arrived and went about his business. The rest of the market was less neutral. Children stared. Men made comments to each other that were just audible enough to be intentional. Women from the more established households, the wives of merchants and ranchers, the women who ran the quilting circle and the church auxiliary, and whatever else, organized the town's idea of itself. These women looked at Mabel with something that sat between pity and revulsion, and when they bought her bread, they sometimes did it with the careful deliberateness of people touching something they found faintly distasteful. She sold enough to cover her rent and her food, and a small amount set aside each week, for reasons she hadn't fully articulated, yet some instinct that said she needed an exit, needed options, needed something other than this particular room, in this particular boarding house, for the rest of her life. That was her life on the morning. Dorothy Haynes dragged her basket off the table. She had seen Dorothy coming. She always saw Dorothy coming. There was something theatrical about the way the woman moved through a crowd, the slight forward tilt of her chin that announced she was about to do something she'd already justified to herself. Mabel had thought Dorothy was just going to say something. That was usually how it went. A comment, designed to land in front of witnesses, designed to remind everyone in earshot where Mabel stood in the order of things. She hadn't expected the hands on the basket. The bread hit the dirt in that particular way that food hits dirt, not dramatic, just sudden and wrong. 4 loaves she'd been up since 4 to bake. One of them split open on impact, and the inside, still faintly warm, pressed into the mud. Dorothy dusted her hands off against each other, like she was done with a piece of work. "You've got flour on your table edge," she said, gesturing vaguely at the now empty table. "Customers don't want to see that." It wasn't even a good excuse. Wasn't meant to be. Mabel crouched down and started picking up the loaves, checking which ones could be salvaged. Her knees ached, her back ached. The mud was cold, and she didn't have a spare pair of gloves. She could hear the murmur of the market continuing around her, the ordinary sounds of people buying and selling things, of a Tuesday morning that was not particularly notable to anyone who didn't have their bread in the dirt. You should consider, Dorothy said, still standing there, whether this is really the right kind of work for you. There are other arrangements for women in your situation. She meant the laundry house on the edge of town, the work nobody else wanted. Mabel didn't answer. She set 2 salvageable loaves back on the table and wrapped the split one in her cloth. Her hands were steady. She made sure they were steady. Dorothy eventually moved on. The market moved on. Old Vic, at the next table, had been looking at his herbs the entire time, with the careful attention of a man who'd decided not to get involved, and Mabel didn't blame him for it. She reset the basket, straightened the cloth, and stood up. That was when she heard it, not at first the crying, but something before crying, something thinner and more desperate, the sound a thing makes when it's almost past the point of sound. Turned. A man had come into the market on a horse that looked like it had been ridden without stopping, big broad through the shoulders, trail dusty, with the kind of face that had been weathered into angles, and he was holding something against his chest with one arm. In the way people hold things, they're terrified of dropping. His horse was blowing hard, sides heaving, and the man was already swinging down before it had quite stopped. He looked around the market with the wild focus of someone who doesn't have time to be polite and knows it. His eyes went from face to face, merchant to merchant, woman to woman, and the look on his face was not the look of a man shopping. It was the look of a man running out of time. Mabel watched him approach. The first woman he reached, Mary Aldrich, wife of the feed store owner, capable and sturdy and generally considered reliable. She saw Mary's face change when she understood what he was asking, saw the way Mary stepped back, shaking her head, arms folding across her chest. The man said something else, lower, and Mary shook her head again and looked away. He moved to the next woman. Same result. Then the next. Mabel's bread didn't move. She watched him work his way through the market with that systematic desperation. Not begging, exactly. Something more contained than begging. More like a man who is doing the only thing left available to him. And she watched every woman he approached look at what he was carrying, understand what he needed, and refuse. He was almost at the end of the row before he reached her table. Up close, she could see the thing against his chest more clearly. A small bundle, wrapped in a man's shirt, moving with the shallow, rapid irregularity of something that had been breathing wrong for too long. The smell reached her a half-second later, that particular sweetness of a newborn underlaid with something sour and concerning, with Simon's. The man looked at her bread. Then he looked at her. He was perhaps 35, maybe older. Hard to tell when the land had worked someone over. His eyes were dark and direct and completely without the particular kind of judgment she was accustomed to receiving in this market. He wasn't seeing her size. He wasn't seeing the widow at the end of the row. He was seeing the only person left in a narrowing list. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. His voice was low and flat and trying very hard to stay controlled. "My daughter is 3 weeks old and she hasn't kept anything down in 2 days. I've asked everyone here." He paused. He was not a man who said things like this easily. She could see that, could see it cost him. "I was told you might that you recently." He stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence without saying what he meant, and what he meant was the thing she'd been trying not to think about for 3 weeks. Mabel looked at the bundle in his arms. The baby made that thin, almost past sound again. It barely moved. "How long since she ate anything that stayed down?" Mabel asked. "Since yesterday morning." She came out from behind her table without deciding to. Her body made the decision before her mind had finished the argument. She held out her arms, and Caleb Mercer hesitated for one fraction of a second, not from reluctance. She understood, but from the shock of someone actually saying yes, and then he placed his daughter in her hands. The baby was so light, it frightened her. She pulled back the edge of the shirt and looked at the child's face, sunken at the cheeks, dry-lipped, the skin around her eyes the wrong color. Her little hands were clenched and barely moving, but she was alive. She turned toward Mabel's warmth with the blind, desperate instinct of something that still wanted to survive. Behind her, Mabel was aware of the market going quiet in that particular way. Crowds go quiet when they're watching something. She heard Dorothy Haynes's voice somewhere to her left. Lord, she actually going to? And then a lower voice, the nerve, in the middle of the market. And then a laugh that she recognized as belonging to one of the herb seller's regular customers, a man who thought cruelty was a form of wit. She didn't look at any of them. She carried the baby to the far end of her table, turned her back to the market, and did what needed to be done. The child latched immediately, desperately, with the grip of something that had been waiting and had nearly stopped waiting. Mabel stood very still and felt the strange simultaneous grief and relief of her body, finally having a purpose again for the thing it had been doing without permission for 3 weeks. Her throat went tight, her eyes burned. She did not cry. Caleb Mercer stood 2 feet behind her, and she could hear him breathing, the long, shaky exhale of a man who had been holding his body in a particular kind of tension for however many hours, and was now, very slightly, releasing it. After a while, he said quietly, "Thank you." She didn't answer right away. She was watching the baby's color change, watching the frantic quality of the feeding slow slightly into something more sustainable. The baby's little hand unclenched against Mabel's arm. "What's her name?" Mabel asked. "Ivy." A pause. Her mother named her. Mabel absorbed that, the past tense of it. "Ivy," she said quietly, to the baby. Not to anyone else. Just to the child, so she'd know someone was using it. From somewhere behind her in the market, she heard Dorothy Haynes say, clear and carrying, "Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. Some of us are trying to eat." Caleb Mercer turned. Mabel heard the shift of his boot on the packed dirt, heard something change in the quality of his silence. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had dropped to something flat and careful in the way a lid goes flat on a pot that is still very hot underneath. "I would be careful right now about what you say next." Dorothy made a sound something between a scoff and a retreat and said nothing else. The baby kept eating. Mabel stood with her back to the crowd and her face to the empty end of the market row, and she felt under the grief, under the ache. Under the weight of everything, the last 3 weeks had been something small and almost unrecognizable. It might have been the beginning of something. She wasn't sure yet. She didn't look up to check. Ivy fell asleep, still holding on. That was the part Mabel remembered most clearly afterward, not the market crowd, not Dorothy's voice, not even Caleb standing behind her like a man waiting for a verdict. Just the baby's hand, unclenching degree by degree against her forearm, until the fingers lay flat and open, the way a fist goes when the fight is finally over. Ivy's breathing had evened out. The frantic quality was gone. She was just sleeping now, the way babies sleep when they've gotten what they needed completely. Without apology, as though sleep were the most urgent thing in the world. Mabel stood there a little longer than strictly necessary. She was aware of that. She couldn't quite make herself hand the child back yet. When she finally turned, Caleb Mercer was watching her with an expression she didn't know how to read. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or it was gratitude, but layered under something more complicated. Relief, maybe. And something else underneath that, something rawer, that he shut down quickly when he noticed her looking. "She'll need to eat again in a few hours," Mabel said. Kept her voice practical. Practical was easier. "She's very dehydrated. You need to watch the soft spot on her head if it sinks in more. That's serious." "I know." He reached for the baby, and Mabel transferred her carefully, the way you hand someone something fragile that belongs to them. "I've been watching it. Do you have anyone at the ranch?" "A woman, I mean. Someone who can stay with her." He didn't answer immediately, and in that pause she had her answer. "The woman who was helping me left 2 weeks ago," he said finally. "Family situation. I've been managing." She looked at him steadily. Managing with a 3-week-old who hadn't kept food down in 2 days. on a ranch alone. She did not say what she thought about that. He already knew what she thought about that. "I'll be back at the market Thursday," she said. "If you need to bring her again." He nodded. Then he said, "Miss Carter." He stopped. Started again. "I'd like to compensate you. For today." "Don't!" She turned back to her table and began straightening what was left of her bread. Take care of her. She heard him behind her for a moment, that particular stillness of someone who has more to say and is deciding against it, and then the sound of him walking away, and the horse, and the market gradually reassembling itself into ordinary noise. Dorothy Haynes had not left. Of course she hadn't left. She was standing with two other women near the egg table, and when Mabel looked up, she caught the tail end of their conversation, not the words. But the shape of it, the way all three of them looked away at slightly different moments, like a flock of birds startled in sequence. Old Vic, at the herb table, cleared his throat. "Sold 3 loaves while you were busy," he said, without looking up. "Told 'em 50 cents each. That right?" Mabel blinked. "That's right." He slid the coins across the table without ceremony and went back to sorting his dried lavender. It was possibly the kindest thing anyone had done for her in weeks, and it was done with such complete indifference that she could accept it without having to feel grateful in any complicated way. Packed up at noon with 4 loaves, sold and 1 ruined, and a body that felt like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. The walk back to the boarding house was 12 minutes. Counted them. The room at Haynes' boarding house was not a bad room, technically. It had a window that faced east, which meant light in the morning. It had a writing desk that wobbled on its left rear leg, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and old lavender sachets. Bed was firm. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Miss Pryor's nightly coughing through the plaster, which she had eventually stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing a clock ticking. The room did not have was any particular quality of home. She had been in it for 14 months, and it still looked like a place someone was staying temporarily. Her few personal items, a small framed daguerreotype of her parents, her mother's recipe book, Thomas's carpenter's square that she'd kept without knowing exactly why. These things sat on the desk and the windowsill and didn't quite make the place hers. She set down the breadbasket and sat on the edge of the bed and did not move for a while. The afternoon light came through the east window at the wrong angle. By this hour, it hit the far wall and made a long orange rectangle that moved almost imperceptibly. She watched it move. She thought about Ivy's hand unclenching. She thought about the sound that Baby had made, that thin, desperate sound in the market, and the way it had stopped. She thought about Clara, which she tried not to do in the middle of the day, because the middle of the day was for working. She got up and started the mending pile. Caleb came back the next morning. Not Thursday, Wednesday, 1 day early, and he didn't come to the market. He came to the boarding house at 7th, which she knew because Dorothy met him at the door, and she heard the exchange from the top of the stairs, where she'd been coming down with her bread basket. "Mrs. Carter doesn't receive visitors," Dorothy was saying, in her most administrative voice. "I'm not a visitor," Caleb said. "I need to speak with her. This is a respectable establishment, Mr. Mercer. Caleb Mercer. My ranch is 12 miles north on the Sweetwater Road. I'll wait outside." He said it with the particular patience of a man who has decided to be patient and is not going to be moved from that decision, regardless of what happens. Dorothy made a sound and closed the door, and when she turned and saw Mabel on the stairs, she drew herself up as though she'd been caught at something. "There's a man outside for you," she said, with a tone that managed to make this sound mildly scandalous. "I heard," Mabel said. She came down the stairs. He was standing on the porch, hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a slow rotation that suggested he'd been thinking hard on the way over and hadn't quite finished thinking. Ivy was in the crook of his arm, wrapped in a clean blanket this time, and she was awake, her eyes, dark like her father's, moving with that vague, unfocused attention of very young infants. "She ate this morning," he said, before Mabel could speak. "Kept it down. Good, but she's not right yet. I can see she's not right yet." He stopped rotating the hat. I want to offer you a position at the ranch. Room and board and a fair wage. And I know that's a change from what you're doing now. But I need someone who can. I need someone there. Consistently. Not just market days. Mabel looked at him. Then she looked at Ivy. How long would this arrangement be? She asked. As long as you need, as long as it works. He paused. I'm not offering charity. I need someone who knows what they're doing with a child this young. You clearly do. I had a baby 3 weeks ago, she said flatly. She died. That's why I have milk. That's the whole of my expertise. She said it deliberately, not to be cruel to herself, but because she wanted him to understand exactly what he was getting. And she'd found that men in particular sometimes built a fiction around women that made things complicated later. He didn't flinch, he just nodded, once slowly. I know. I'm sorry you heard about it. Ruth Cobb told me. She's the one who said your name. Another pause. She said you were the most capable woman in Harlan Creek who wasn't currently spoken for. Ruth Cobb, of course. The midwife who had sat with her for 11 hours and then stayed 2 more and then come to the burial without being asked. Ruth, who had apparently been keeping an eye on her from a distance in the way certain women kept quiet eyes on other women they were worried about. Mabel was going to have to thank her for that, and possibly also be annoyed at her. Both things seemed true. The room, she said. What's it like? Something in Caleb's posture shifted not quite relief, but adjacent to it. He knew she was negotiating, not refusing. Separate from the main house. There's a small room off the kitchen. It had a stove. I won't pretend it's comfortable, but it's private, and it's yours. I have work here. Market twice a week. The ranch is 12 miles. If you needed to come in for market, I could. I'm not giving up the market, she said it quietly, but without any room in it. Whatever else I do, I keep the market. He considered that. All right. And I want it in writing. The wage, the terms, what's expected. He blinked. She could see he hadn't anticipated that, not resistance, just the specificity of it. Good. She needed him to understand she wasn't desperate enough to be careless. I can do that, he said. Give me a day to think on it. She went back inside. She did not look at Dorothy Haynes, who was absolutely not pretending to dust the hallway table, and she went up the stairs and sat at her wobbling desk and looked at the wall for a long time. The thing about Ivy's hand unclenching was that it had done something to her she couldn't quite name and couldn't quite put away. It had reached into the locked room she'd been constructing for 3 weeks, the room where Clara was, where the grief was, where the physical ache of her body, still producing milk for a child who didn't need it, lived, and it had opened something in there. Not healed it. Nothing like that. Just opened it. Let some air in. She thought about the rented room. Orange rectangle of light on the wall. The mending pile. Thursday market. Dorothy Haynes's hands on her bread basket. She wrote a letter to Ruth Cobb. She wrote it in 3 sentences. I'm considering Mercer's offer. Did you vouch for him because he's trustworthy? Or because you thought I needed the push? Either way, thank you. She sent it with the afternoon post and started packing her trunk before she'd consciously decided not to. The wagon ride out to the Mercer Ranch took 2 hours on a road that was less a road than a general suggestion about direction. Caleb drove without talking much, which suited her. Ivy slept in a small wooden box lined with blankets that sat between them on the bench as a makeshift arrangement that he'd clearly been using for transport, and that worked considerably better than anything involving only one arm and a galloping horse. She looked at the land as they went. It was March, still more winter than spring, and the grass was the color of old straw and went a long way in every direction. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of very cold days that are trying to warm up and not quite managing it. Could see, at intervals, the dark lines of creek beds and once a stand of cottonwoods that meant water below, their upper branches just beginning to show the faint yellowish hint of coming green. It was not beautiful in any soft way. It was the kind of landscape that didn't care whether you found it beautiful or not, which she appreciated. The ranch, when it came into view, told her things before she even climbed down from the wagon. The The house itself was solid good bones. Someone had built it with intention, but the yard was in the particular state of entropy that happens when a capable person is overwhelmed by too many demands at once. A section of fence along the near paddock leaned at an angle that would eventually become falling. Kitchen garden was a tangle of dead plants from last year, uncleared. The chicken coop at the far end of the yard had a gap in its wire that would let in anything with the persistence to look for it. She didn't seize any of this. She got down from the wagon and picked up Ivy's makeshift box and carried her toward the house. Inside was better cleaner than she'd expected, which told her something about him. Kitchen had a good stove, a large table, and enough light from the 2 west-facing windows to work by. The pantry was low but not empty. The room off the kitchen that was to be hers was small and plainly furnished a bed, a washstand, a chair, the small stove he'd mentioned, but the floor was swept, and there was a fresh piece of calico tacked over the window that hadn't been there long. He'd prepared it. That meant something. She set Ivy's box on the kitchen table and turned around. Caleb was in the doorway, watching her take stock of the place with the slightly braced look of a man waiting to be told what's wrong. "Coop needs wire," she said. "You're losing birds to something getting in at night, I'd guess." He let out a breath. "Weasel, I think. I've patched it twice. Patch needs to be bigger. Whatever you're patching, go 6 inches further in every direction they find the edge of the repair." She turned back to Ivy. "She'll need to eat in about an hour. Is there a chair in here that's comfortable for?" "I'll get the rocker from the front room." He brought it without being asked again. That was also something. The first week was about learning the rhythm of a place and a child at the same time, which turned out to be exactly as exhausting as it sounded. Ivy ate every 2 to 3 hours without fail, including through the night, and in between feedings, she required the particular intensive attention of a newborn who was making up for lost ground. She was hungry for warmth, for sound, for the specific reassurance of being held by something alive and warm and present. Mabel slept in pieces and woke in pieces and functioned in pieces, and during the hours she was upright. She also managed the kitchen and the pantry and the basic organization of a house that had been running on a rancher's definition of functional for too long. Caleb was up before her most mornings, already out with the cattle by the time she had Ivy settled and the stove lit. He came in for midday meals and ate without complaint, and with the particular focus of a man who views eating as a task to be completed rather than an experience to be enjoyed. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't much of anything, yet just careful, in the way people are careful, around someone they're still figuring out. On the 4th day, she fixed the chicken coop. She did it in the afternoon, while Ivy slept. She found the wire in the barn, found the staple gun hanging on its nail, and went to work on the gap with the methodical patience of someone who has fixed things before and knows that the difference between a good repair and a temporary one is the willingness to take twice as long. Caleb came back from the south pasture as she was finishing and stood at the fence watching her for a moment before she noticed him. "I was going to do that," he said. "I know. I did it instead." She pressed the last staple in and stood up, brushing wire flecks off her apron. "You've got 3 hens that are probably too stressed to lay right now. Give them a week." He looked at the repair. Then he looked at her. "You've done that before. My father kept chickens, and a carpenter husband teaches you things, whether you ask to learn them or not." She picked up the tools. "The fence on the north paddock is worse than the coop. I can show you where, if you want, or you can find it yourself, but it needs to happen before the ground thaws, or you'll lose the post." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you say something the day you arrived?" "Because I'd been here 4 hours. It wasn't my place yet." She started walking back toward the house. "It's my place now," she heard him. Behind her, not following, just standing there for a moment, and then the sound of him heading toward the north paddock, which was what she'd intended. That evening he came in for supper and ate the stew she'd made from what was in the pantry and said, without preamble, "That's the best thing I've had in this kitchen in 8 months." She said, "The pantry needs restocking. I can give you a list." "All right." and the garden needs to be cleared before it can be planted. If I'm going to feed us from it by summer, it needs to start now." He looked at her across the table. "You're planning to stay that long?" She met his eyes. "I told you I wasn't giving notice without cause. That goes both directions. I'm not leaving unless there's cause." He looked down at his bowl. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite catch, something almost like the beginning of relief, or something older than relief. "All right," he said again. Ivy made a small sound from the rocker by the stove, the preliminary complaint that meant she was about to wake up wanting to eat. Mabel was already pushing back her chair. The trouble started in the second week, and it came, as trouble in small communities so often does, from a sideways direction. Caleb had 2 hired men who worked the ranch, a lean, permanently squinting man named Pete Greer, who had been with him for 3 years, and a younger one called Danny Foss, who was 18, and had the kind of good looks that he'd clearly been told about too often. They worked out of the bunkhouse and ate their meals separately, which was the arrangement that had existed before Mabel arrived, and which she had no interest in changing. What changed was their awareness of her. She noticed it first in small ways, the way Pete would find reasons to be near the kitchen window during the hours she was working in there. Comments passed between him and Danny that were just below the level of fully audible, followed by Danny's quick, sharp laugh. She did not engage with it. She had encountered this species of man before, the kind who used a woman's vulnerability as a measuring stick for how much he could get away with, and her policy with that species was to give them nothing. The direct confrontation came on a Thursday, market day. She was loading the bread basket into the wagon. At 6 in the morning, Ivy settled in her box in the back when Pete came around the corner of the barn and stopped in a way that blocked her path to the driver's seat without quite being in her way. "Mercer's not here to drive you in," he said. He had a piece of straw in his teeth and was working it back and forth with the studied casualness of someone who has planned what they're going to say and is performing the preamble. "He's out at the South Water. Might be there all day." "I know," she said. "I'm driving myself." Pete looked at the wagon, then at her with an expression that managed to be dubious and dismissive simultaneously. "That's a long drive for a woman." 12 miles, I've done longer." She stepped to the side to go around him. He didn't move. Not aggressively, not in a way she could call out cleanly, but enough. Danny and me were thinking. "About the arrangement here." Stopped. She looked at him directly. "Were you just thinking that it's a little irregular? Woman living in the house. No relation to the man." He shrugged, easy and deliberate. "People in town are going to talk. Already talking, probably." "People in town talked about me before I came here," she said. "I survived it." "Sure." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that has no warmth in it at all, just the shape of one. "Thing is, a man's reputation takes a different kind of damage than a woman's. And Mercer's a man with standing in this county. Might be worth considering whether you're the right fit." She stood with her bread basket and looked at Pete Greer and felt the full weight of what he was doing, not just the comment, but the careful architecture of it. The way it was constructed to sound like concern while being a threat. He was telling her she was replaceable, that her presence here was contingent, that someone could make it difficult for her with a few well-placed words, and that someone was suggesting he might be willing to do exactly that. She had 2 options, and she knew it. She could engage, defend herself, argue the point, give him the reaction he was waiting for, or she could not. "Move out of my way, Mr. Greer," she said. Her voice was the same temperature it had been before he started talking. He hesitated, she could see. He hadn't expected her to be this flat about it, and then he stepped aside, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench and took the reins and drove out of the yard without looking back. Her hands weren't shaking. She made sure of that before she allowed herself to think about the conversation at all. And by the time she reached the main road, she had made a decision. She would not tell Caleb. Not yet. Not because she was afraid to, but because the moment she said something, she would become a woman who needed a man to handle her problems, and she was not that woman. She was going to handle this herself, and if she couldn't, then she'd say something. The market was the market. Dorothy Haynes was there, and Dorothy's eyes found her immediately, and the small ripple of awareness that moved through the nearby stalls when she set up told her that yes, people had been talking. She set up her table and arranged her bread and waited. The first person who came to buy was Agnes Fowler, the woman who had come to Clara's burial without being asked. Agnes was perhaps 50, weathered and direct, with the kind of face that had made its peace with things. She bought 2 loaves and paid full price, and didn't make anything of it one way or the other, which was exactly right. "Heard you went out to the Mercer place," Agnes said, straightening her parcel. "Yes, Ivy doing better?" "Considerably." Agnes nodded. "Good." She started to go, then paused. "Dorothy's been talking. You should know that," I figured. "She's saying." Agnes stopped, chose her words. "She's saying it's not a proper arrangement. You know how she says things." "Yes. Just so you know what's going around." Agnes gave her a look not pitying, not dramatic, just direct. The look of one woman telling another something useful. Some people aren't listening to her. I want you to know that too. She was gone before Mabel could respond. Mabel sold 9 loaves that morning, which was 3 more than usual, and she didn't let herself wonder too hard about whether some of those sales were Agnes's doing. On the ride home, she thought about Pete Greer's face when she'd told him to move. The slight flicker of surprise, she stored that. She wasn't done with the information yet. Caleb was in the yard when she got back, mending the north paddock fence, which he'd found exactly where she'd told him it would be. He looked up when the wagon came in and watched her drive it around to the barn, with the attentiveness of someone who'd been half expecting a problem. She unharnessed the horse herself, settled it, and came out of the barn to find him still standing there. "Say something to you this morning?" he asked. She looked at him. "What makes you think that?" "Because he's been useful and reliable for 3 years, and this morning he was doing that thing he does when he thinks he can get away with something." Caleb's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "And then I came back for midday, and the kitchen was too quiet." She considered lying, or deflecting, and then decided against both. "He suggested my presence here might damage your reputation, that I might not be the right fit." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you say to him?" "I told him to move out of my way." Another pause. "And did he?" "Yes." Caleb looked out toward the bunkhouse. Something moved through his jaw, a small tightening, quickly controlled. "I'll talk to him. I'd rather you didn't make it about me." He looked back at her, surprised. "If you go in there and make it about defending me, then I become the problem that required defending," she said. "I'd rather that conversation be about what you expect from the men who work here, in general, as their employer, without reference to me specifically." He stared at her for long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said quietly, "That's a smarter approach than the one I was going to take." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, more the beginning of one that he caught before it arrived. He turned and went toward the bunkhouse, and she went into the kitchen to start the evening meal and check on Ivy, who had been asleep for 40 minutes and would wake hungry and loud in approximately 20 more. Kitchen was warm from the stove she'd banked before leaving. The afternoon light came through the west windows at that particular low golden angle that made even plain things look considered. Ivy stirred in the rocker, one small fist lifting and dropping in her sleep. Mabel stood in the doorway for a moment, just stood there, with the bread basket still over her arm, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking in the air around her, and some specific quality of the moment settled into her chest in a way that was uncomfortable because it felt too close to belonging. She didn't trust belonging. Belonging was what you felt right before the thing was taken away. She hung up the basket and started on supper. From outside, see now through the kitchen window, she could hear the low murmur of Caleb's voice in the bunkhouse, steady and without heat, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is explaining it, not arguing it. Could not hear Pete's response. She didn't need to. Ivy woke up hungry, right on schedule, and Mabel went to her, and the evening assembled itself around them, the stove, the crying that stopped, footsteps on the porch that were Caleb coming back in, the ordinary sounds of three people occupying the same house at the end of a complicated day. Nothing was resolved. The town was still talking. Pete Greer was still in the bunkhouse. 12 miles away, Dorothy Haynes was still Dorothy Haynes. But the north paddock fence would hold the spring thaw, and the chickens were laying again, and Ivy's hide been had good for 4 days straight. Mabel took those things and put them somewhere careful, and she did not ask for more than that. Pete Greer did not say another word to her directly. Whatever Caleb had told him in the bunkhouse that evening had landed somewhere that mattered, because the next morning, Pete was in the yard before dawn, doing his work with the particular focused silence of a man who has been reminded of his position and is deciding how to feel about it. Danny Foss took his cues from Pete and went equally quiet, and for several days the ranch operated in a careful, functional truce that nobody named out loud. Mabel did not mistake the quiet for resolution. She had known men like Pete long enough to understand that what looked like retreat was usually just regrouping. He hadn't changed his mind. He'd changed his tactics. She kept working. The kitchen garden was her project for the mornings after Ivy's early feeding, when the lights was still low and the ground cold but workable. She'd found a spade in the barn that was better balanced than the others, and she went at the tangle of dead growth from last year with the methodical patience she brought to everything, clearing the beds row by row, turning the soil where it had compacted, working in the composted material she'd found in a neglected heap behind the barn that Caleb apparently hadn't known existed. Her back ached. Her knees ached. She took breaks when she needed them and didn't when she didn't. And by the end of the first week, she had 4 beds cleared and ready. Caleb came out one morning and stood at the garden fence and looked at what she'd done. "My wife planted this," he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned her directly, and he said it with the particular flatness of someone reporting a fact they've made peace with, mostly. What did she grow? He thought about it. Beans. Squash. She tried tomatoes twice, and they never came in right. He paused. She liked the trying more than the growing, I think. Mabel turned another row of soil and didn't look up. "I'm going to plant more root vegetables. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, things that store well. Is that all right? It's your garden." She stopped and looked at him. Then, because that was a particular kind of statement, he said it simply, without calculation, the way people say things they mean, without having decided to mean them. He was looking at the cleared beds, not at her. "It's your land," she said. "Right now it's your garden." He put his hands in his pockets and turned back toward the barn. "Potatoes are fine." She went back to work and didn't let herself think about what he'd said or how it had sounded for the rest of the morning. April came in with rain and wind and the specific misery of a high plains spring that can't decide whether winter is finished with it. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Caleb's property rose 4 inches in a week, which wasn't dangerous yet but needed watching. Cattle had made it through the winter with only 2 losses, which Caleb said was better than the previous year. And he said it with the careful, non-committal satisfaction of a man who has learned not to celebrate anything the land hasn't finished with yet. Ivy was 6 weeks old and had become gradually a different kind of creature than the desperate, silent thing Mabel had first held in the market. She was gaining weight. Mabel tracked it with the practical attention of someone managing a recovery, and not with the sentimentality of someone who didn't dare get attached, except that she was attached. She had known it for a while and had been avoiding the full weight of knowing it, but it was there, undeniable, in the way she listened for Ivy's breathing across the room at night and felt something specific shift in her chest when the baby made the small, satisfied sounds she made after eating. She had told herself in the beginning that this was just biology, body doing what it was built to do, finding a purpose for the milk that hadn't had one. She had told herself that she was a practical woman performing a practical function and that she could maintain appropriate distance from the outcome. She stopped telling herself that somewhere around week 4, when Ivy had looked up at her during a feeding, with those dark, unfocused eyes, and moved her mouth in the beginning of something that was not quite a smile but was trying to become one. And Mabel had felt, in her chest, the thing she had been holding the door shut against for weeks. She did not say anything about this to anyone. It was hers to manage, and she would manage it. What she said to Ruth Cobb in the letter she wrote on a Sunday afternoon, while Caleb was out checking fence line, was, "She's doing well. Better than I expected. The hard part is that well and better are not the same as safe, and I am aware that my situation here is contingent on her needing me, and I don't know what happens after that." Ruth wrote back in 4 days. Her letters were short and direct, like the woman herself. "You're already past contingent, Mabel. You just haven't looked up long enough to see it. How's the rancher?" Mabel did not write back about the rancher. The first major confrontation of spring came not from Pete Greer or from Dorothy Haynes, but from a man named Gerald Whitmore, which was a name she hadn't known before and didn't want to know after. Whitmore was a cattle buyer from the county seat, a heavy, prosperous-looking man with the groomed confidence of someone who has never been told no often enough. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday with 2 other men who did not introduce themselves, and Caleb went out to meet him in the yard with the particular wariness he got around. People he didn't trust but had to do business with. Mabel watched from the kitchen window while she was working. She wasn't trying to overhear, but the kitchen window was open because she'd been baking, and the voices it carried. Whitmore did his business in the way of men who consider business a performance, loud, with a lot of references to his own past successes and a lot of almost compliments that were actually measurements. He and Caleb talked cattle prices for 20 minutes, and Mabel could tell from Caleb's posture that particular economy of movement he used when he was containing something that the offer on the table was not a good one, and Whitmore knew it. Then Whitmore looked toward the house. "Heard you've got a woman out here," he said with the kind of casual that isn't casual. "Housekeeper situation?" "Something like that," Caleb said. "Widow from town, someone told me." Whitmore turned back to survey the yard with proprietary ease. "You want to be careful with those arrangements, Mercer. Widow women get ideas." Caleb said nothing. Especially, Whitmore made a gesture, vague and dismissive, that Mabel understood was about her body, her size, the specific category of woman he'd put her in well. The kind that are grateful for the position. If you know what I mean. Sets up dependence, makes it complicated to end the arrangement when the time comes. Caleb was quiet for a moment that stretched. "Gerald," he said, finally, in the tone he had used with Pete that evening, steady. Without heat, nothing argued. "You want to talk cattle prices or not?" Whitmore laughed. He thought it was a deflection. He thought Caleb was embarrassed and letting it pass. He moved back to business, and they finished the negotiation. Caleb accepted less than the cattle were worth, because the alternative was waiting for the next buyer, and he didn't have that kind of time this season, and Whitmore left with his unnamed companions in a cloud of self-satisfaction. Caleb came inside. Mabel was taking bread out of the oven and did not turn around. "I heard some of that," she said. "I know." He sat down at the kitchen table. He sounded tired, not from the negotiation, but from the specific exhaustion of people requiring you to manage their opinions of you all day. "He's been buying in this county for 15 years. Every rancher out here has taken his price at least once, because sometimes there's no other option. I know how that works." She set the bread on the rack and turned around. "What did he offer?" he told her. She did her arithmetic quickly. "That's 20 cents a head under market." "Yes. Could you have waited for another buyer?" He looked at the table. "The spring expenses are heavier than I planned. Early calves cost more than." He stopped. He was not a man who easily explained his financial constraints to anyone. She could see that. It cost him something. "No, I couldn't wait." She put a cup of coffee in front of him. She'd started making it the way he drank it without being asked, because she'd noticed, and she was a noticing kind of person, and sat down across from him. "Then you made the right call," she said. "There's no point in a principle you can't afford to keep." He looked up, surprised. I'm not saying he wasn't wrong, she added. He was wrong. The price and everything else. But you made the right call for what the situation actually was, not for what you wished it was. That's all you can do. He looked at her for a moment. You're remarkably practical for someone who has substantial cause to be angry about what he said. I am angry about what he said. She said it evenly, the way she said most things. I'm just not going to let my anger about it cost you 20 cents a head on top of what he already took. Caleb was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a sound that was almost a laugh, real brief, a little startled, as though it had gotten out before he decided to allow it. Put his hand over his face and then took it away and looked at the coffee. Mabel, he said. What? I don't know what I was doing before you came here. Genuinely don't know. She felt that land somewhere in her chest and made a deliberate decision to treat it as a practical statement rather than anything else. You were managing, she said. Badly, but managing. Same as everyone. He nodded. He drank his coffee. The afternoon went on around them. The garden came in slowly, the way real things come in, not all at once. Not with any drama, just the patient accumulation of small visible changes that you had to look for because they didn't announce themselves. Potato shoots came up first, then the carrots, then the line of turnips along the south edge of the bed. Mabel found herself checking the garden each morning with Ivy in her arms, pointing things out to the baby in a low voice, as though Ivy had any capacity to understand what a potato shoot was. She knew she was doing it. She couldn't quite make herself stop. Caleb caught her at it once and said nothing, but she caught the expression on his face before could compose it something open and unguarded that he quickly folded back into his usual, contained manner. She filed that away. She wasn't sure what to do with it, but she filed it. Ruth Cobb came out to the ranch in mid-April, ostensibly to check on Ivy's progress, actually to check on Mabel, and Mabel was glad to see her on both accounts. Ruth was a small, wiry woman of 52 who moved through the world with the efficiency of someone who has delivered several hundred babies and developed, through that experience, a complete absence of squeamishness about anything. She examined Ivy with the practiced thoroughness of a professional and announced that the child was doing exactly what she should be doing and that whatever Mabel was feeding her was clearly working. She's going to be a big girl, Ruth said, holding Ivy up to the window light and peering at her with those sharp eyes. Good solid weight now, good color. She had a gap at the start, Mabel said. That's going to matter for a while. She needs to be watched for any sign of falling behind again. She'll have good watching. Ruth settled Ivy against her shoulder and looked at Mabel over the baby's head with that direct assessment. And you? You sleeping? In pieces. Eating enough. Ruth made a sound that was not quite skeptical and not quite satisfied. How's the arrangement? The man treating you properly? Mabel considered the question for a moment. Yes, she said. He is. And in what? Ruth gave her the look that had probably made many women in labor confess things they hadn't intended to. You know what I'm asking? I'm not answering it, Mabel said. Some coffee. Ruth stayed for 2 hours and managed, in that time, to also give Caleb her professional assessment of his daughter. Tell him plainly that whatever arrangement he had with Mabel had almost certainly saved Ivy's life, and he should bear that in mind always, and recommend 3 specific things he should plant along the creek bank to prevent erosion. Caleb received all of this with the slight bewildered attention of a man who has been assessed by a force of nature and isn't sure whether to be grateful or simply relieved. After Ruth's wagon had disappeared down the road, he came in from where he'd been standing on the porch and said, "She's something." "She is," Mabel agreed. She said, "You almost certainly saved Ivy's life. She's being generous." She didn't seem like a person who says things generously. He was in the kitchen doorway, and there was something in the way he was standing that was different from his usual careful distance, closer to the surface. Something. She seemed like a person who says exactly what she means. Mabel was washing Ivy's cloth and didn't look up from the wash basin. Then maybe she means it. You don't take that well. Take what? Being told you did something that mattered. She kept washing the cloth. The water was warm and the work was simple, and she stayed focused on it because it was easier than the conversation. I do what's necessary, what's in front of me. That's all I've ever done. That's not a small thing, he said. That's not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing. You act like it is. He said it without accusation, just observation, the way he said things when he'd been thinking about them for a while. You act like everything you do is just the obvious next step. Like anyone would have done it. Anyone should have. They didn't. A pause. In the market, all those women didn't. She finally looked up. He was watching her with those direct dark eyes, and for once he hadn't folded whatever he was thinking back behind his usual composure. He just looked at her. It was a disconcerting experience, being looked at without the particular qualitative assessments she was accustomed to from the town, without the measuring and the categorizing and the silent verdict. He was just looking. She looked away first. "Supper in an hour," she said. He went back outside. She kept washing the cloth. Her hands were steady. She made sure they were steady. The letter from Dorothy Haynes arrived at the end of April, and it was not addressed to Mabel. It was addressed to Caleb, and it came with the Tuesday post that Danny Foss brought back from town with the supply order. Mabel didn't know about the letter until 2 days later, when Caleb put it on the kitchen table in front of her without comment and sat down and waited. She read it. It was 3 paragraphs, carefully written in Dorothy's firm school teacher hand, and it covered the following points. Town of Harlan Creek was a community of values, and that the current arrangement at the Mercer Ranch was a subject of concern among its more upstanding residents, that Mabel Carter was, through no one's fault, a woman of compromised circumstance whose situation invited a particular kind of speculation, that Caleb, as a man of standing, had a responsibility to consider how his choices reflected on the county's pioneer families, and that there were, so Dorothy was sure he'd agree, more suitable arrangements available for his daughter's care through the church women's auxiliary. The last paragraph suggested, with a kind of genteel precision that was worse than being direct, that Mabel's history specifically referenced as her losses, of which we are all aware indicated an instability that made her unsuitable as a primary caregiver for an infant. Mabel set the letter down. Her history, her losses. Clara turned into a bureaucratic argument for why she couldn't be trusted. She was quiet for a long moment. Caleb sat across from her and watched her face with that careful watchfulness. "When did you get this?" she asked. "Tuesday." "You waited 2 days. I was deciding what to do with it." She looked at him. "And what are you deciding?" He reached across the table and picked up the letter and folded it in half, and then in half again, and then he got up and put it in the stove, without drama and without ceremony, and came back and sat down. "Nothing," he said. "I'm deciding nothing, because there's nothing to decide." She watched the paper catch. Caleb. She said his first name deliberately. She used it rarely, and it meant something when she did, and they both knew it. "This is causing you problems with people you need to work with." "I work with cattle and fencing and weather," he said. "Dorothy Haynes doesn't come into it. That's not how a community works, and you know it." "Then that's the community's problem." He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "Mabel, I want to be direct with you about something." She waited. "When I came to that market, I was desperate. I'm not going to dress that up. I needed someone for Ivy, and I was out of options, and you were what was left." He said it straight, without apology, because it was the truth, and he clearly thought she deserved the truth rather than a softer version. "But that is not what you are now, you understand? That's not what this is. What you've done here, what you've built here in 2 months. The garden, the coop, the kitchen, the way you run this place, the way Ivy looks now versus how she looked in that market." He stopped. He wasn't a man who made speeches, and he'd used up something to make this one. "I don't need Dorothy Haynes to explain to me what value you have, and I don't need her telling you either." Mabel sat with that for a moment. It was a lot. She was not accustomed to a lot. "All right," she said finally. "All right, all right." She pushed back her chair and stood up and went back to the bread she'd been making before the letter interrupted things. Supper's going to be late if I don't start the dough. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her back. That's all you've got to say? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something. She worked the dough in silence for a moment. Then she said, without turning around, "Thank you for burning the letter and for the other things." She heard the exhale behind her. "You're welcome," he said, and it was quiet in the kitchen again. Pete Greer made his second move in May, and this time he didn't do it to her face. She heard it from Danny Foss, which she hadn't expected. Danny came to the kitchen door on a Thursday morning while Caleb was out at the North Water and knocked with the nervous energy of someone who has talked himself into something and is not sure he did the right thing. Miss Carter. He had his hat in his hands and was doing the same rotating thing with it that Caleb sometimes did, except where Caleb's version was controlled. Danny's was anxious. "I need to tell you something." She opened the door fully. "Come in, I'd rather can we just..." He stayed on the porch. Pete's been writing letters to men in town, Whitmore, some others, sayings that he's saying things about you and Mr. Mercer that aren't true, about the arrangement, making it sound like. He stopped, red-faced, like it's not proper. Mabel felt the cold arrive behind her breastbone and kept her face where it was. "How long has this been going on?" "Couple weeks, maybe more." Danny looked miserable. "I didn't. I tried to tell him to stop. He says it's just talk, but it's going to places where it'll do damage." "Why are you telling me?" He looked at his boots. "'Cause what he's saying isn't true, and because..." He stopped again, looked up. "You fixed the coop. Nobody asked you to. You just did it because it needed doing. And Pete's, he's just mean, is what he is. He doesn't like that you're good at things." It was perhaps the most direct thing she'd ever heard Danny Foss say, and it surprised her enough that she almost showed it. "Thank you, Danny," she said. "This is between me and Caleb and Pete. It's not your problem to carry." He nodded. He looked slightly less miserable for having put it down. She let him go and stood in the kitchen with the weight of it, and then she went to Ivy, who was awake in the rocker and making small demanding noises about nothing in particular, and picked her up and held her and thought. The instinct was still the same as it had been with the first Pete incident. Handle it herself. Protect Caleb from having to fight her battles. Don't become the woman who requires defending. But this was different. This was Pete actively working to damage her, standing in the county, which meant eventually it would damage Caleb, whether Caleb wanted her to handle it herself or not. This had moved past her to manage alone. She waited for Caleb to come in at midday and told him everything, including Danny's involvement, in the same flat, practical tone she used for everything that needed to be addressed. He sat at the table and listened, without interrupting, which was one of the things about him. She'd come to rely on the particular quality of his attention when something mattered, the way he didn't reach for the easy response before he'd thought. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. She was momentarily surprised. She'd expected him to tell her what he was going to do, not ask. "I think you need to let him go," she said. "Not because of me or not only, but because a man who will do this will do other things. He's been with you 3 years and he's testing what he can get away with. That's a problem regardless of whether I'm here." Caleb nodded slowly. "Got a brother near Laramie. He can go there." He paused. "Danny?" "Danny told me because he thought it was wrong. Worth something." "Yeah." He stood up. His chair scraped on the kitchen floor. "I'll do it this afternoon, Caleb." He stopped. "It's going to make more talk. A man losing his position, going to Laramie. People will know why, or they'll invent a reason, and either way it circles back." "I know. You're prepared for that." He looked at her, and his face was the one it had been across the kitchen table after Ruth's visit opened, without the careful composure, just him. "I'm prepared for whatever keeping you here costs," he said. "Stop asking me if I'm sure." He went out to the bunkhouse. She stood in the kitchen and held Ivy and listened to the sounds of the yard, the wind, the cattle, the particular mid-May quality of the afternoon light coming through the window, and understood. slowly and with some difficulty, that the word keeping had been deliberate, that he had meant it in a way that was different from their arrangement, that he'd known she would understand that and had said it anyway. She stayed where she was for a long time, with the baby in her arms and the warm kitchen around her and the sound of Caleb's voice, low and final, carrying from the direction of the bunkhouse across the May afternoon. She was not going to make anything of it yet. Things needed to settle. There was too much still uncertain about the town, about Pete's letters, about what the county thought, and what it would cost for her to pick up what he'd put down and carry it yet. But she didn't put it away. That was the difference. She held Ivy a little tighter and let the afternoon light come through the kitchen window and land where it wanted to, and she did not put it away. Pete Greer was gone by Friday. He left without drama, which surprised her. She had expected something on his way out, some parting remark designed to land and linger, kind of thing men like Pete saved for situations where they'd lost and needed to feel like they'd chosen to leave rather than been removed. But Caleb must have said whatever needed saying in a way that closed that door, because Pete loaded his things into a saddlebag on Thursday afternoon and rode out before breakfast the next morning without speaking to anyone. Danny Foss stayed. He came to the kitchen door the evening after Pete left and asked Mabel directly, and with the earnest discomfort of a young man trying to do something right, in a situation he'd helped make difficult, whether she thought he should stay or whether his staying caused problems. She had considered that question honestly before answering, had turned it over and examined it for the ways it could go wrong, and then told him that if he could do his work without making things harder, he was welcome to stay, and that she'd take him at his word that he meant to. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I do." "Then we won't discuss it again," she said, and went back inside, and that was the end of it. What followed Pete's departure was not peace. Exactly, it was more like the particular quiet that settles over a place after a sustained noise stops, when your ears haven't adjusted yet, and you keep expecting the sound to come back. The ranch ran smoother with Danny working alone than it had with both men, which told Mabel something about how much of Pete's energy had been going into things other than cattle and fencing. Caleb took on more of the physical work himself, which was something he seemed to need in the way certain people need hard physical labor to keep the interior quiet, and he came in at the end of those days tired in a cleaner way than before. The talk in town, as Mabel had predicted, got worse before it had any chance of getting better. She knew it from the market, the way the quality of silence around her stall changed, became a slightly more loaded thing, the way certain women she'd had no friction with before now found reasons not to make eye contact. Agnes Fowler still bought bread and still spoke to her directly, and old Vic still reported sales with complete indifference, and Ruth Cobb sent a letter that said simply, "I've heard. Don't let them make you small." Mabel wrote back, "I haven't yet." What she didn't write was how much it cost to not let them, how she counted the market days down, and then counted the hours of each one, standing behind her table with her back straight and her prices reasonable, and her bread good, enduring the looking and the not looking, and the comments that were engineered to be just audible enough. How she came home from each Tuesday and Thursday market and put the horse away and went in cease and sat for 20 minutes before she could make herself start on supper. Just sat with the day's weight on her and let it be heavy for a little while before she picked it back up. She didn't let anyone see the 20 minutes. That was hers. June arrived, and with it the first real summer heat, the kind that settled into the packed earth of the yard and radiated back up through the soles of your boots. The garden Mabel had cleared and planted in those cold March mornings was producing now not abundantly yet, not the full press of midsummer growth, but enough to supplement the kitchen in ways that made a daily difference. The potato rows were lush and dark green. The carrots had come in thick. The beans she'd planted along the south fence were climbing the wire she'd strung for them, which she checked every morning with a satisfaction she permitted herself because it was the honest result of work she'd done, and sometimes honest satisfaction was what kept a person intact. Ivy was 3 months old and had become, in the way of babies who have found their footing, a person with opinions. She had an opinion about being put down when she wanted to be held. She had an opinion about the speed at which things she wanted were produced. She had recently developed an opinion about Caleb specifically. She tracked him across a room with her eyes in a way she didn't track anyone else. And when he came in from outside and leaned over to speak to her, she produced a smile that was so broad and complete, it reorganized her whole face. He was undone by it every time. Mabel watched him try to be sensible about it and fail, and she thought that might be the most purely human thing she'd seen him do. She's going to have you entirely under her authority. Within the year, Mabel told him. One evening, after Ivy had performed the smile approximately 4 times in sequence, and Caleb had made a sound that could only be described as helpless. She already does, he said, without any sign of minding. Mabel handed Ivy to him for the post-supper hour, which had become their arrangement without ever being formally established. Caleb held the baby while Mabel cleaned up, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and the kitchen settled into the quiet of a place at the end of a working day. She had come to understand, her favorite hour. She wouldn't have said that out loud, but it was true. She had not done anything with what Caleb had said in May, the word keeping, the deliberateness of it, the way he hadn't looked away when he said it. She had put it aside, not away. The distinction mattered to her. She wasn't pretending it hadn't happened. She was waiting, the way she waited for most things until she could see the ground clearly enough to step onto it without the risk of it giving way beneath her. She was a woman with a complicated history and no family within 400 miles and a dead child in the town cemetery and a body that the world had spent the last year telling her made her worth less. Those facts did not disappear because a man had said something with deliberate eyes across a kitchen. She needed to be sure that what she thought she'd heard was what had actually been said, and she needed to be sure that she was responding to what was real and not to what she wanted to be real, because those two things could look deceptively similar when you were lonely enough and tired enough. So she waited, and she worked, and she watched. The thing that broke the waiting open was not a conversation. It was a Saturday afternoon in the middle of June, and it arrived without warning, the way the things that matter most have a habit of doing. Caleb had gone into Harlan Creek for supplies, a trip he usually made alone, which he preferred. Mabel was in the garden with Ivy, in the wooden box beside her, doing the afternoon watering, when she heard the wagon coming back earlier than expected. She looked up and registered, before she registered anything else, that Caleb's posture on the bench was different. He was sitting with a rigidity that wasn't his usual contained manner, it was tighter. The whole body held in a way that meant he was managing something. She set down the watering can and picked up Ivy and went to the fence. He got down from the wagon and tied the horse and began unloading the supply boxes without looking at her immediately. And she waited, because he would say it in his own time, or he wouldn't. There was a meeting, he said, finally. He set a flour sack down harder than necessary. The feed store, Aldrich and Whitmore and some others. Saying, he stopped, picked up another box. They're putting pressure on the ranchers in this area, saying the county needs to maintain certain standards. That arrangements like ours reflect poorly on the community and discourage the right kind of settlement. She was quiet. Whitmore specifically, his jaw was doing that thing. He used your name. In a room full of men, said. He put the box down and turned and looked at her, and she could see he was deciding how much to spare her. He said you were a woman of no standing with no prospects, and that I was doing you a charity that had the look of something else, and that men of standing shouldn't— I understand, she said. She didn't need the rest of the sentence. I left before I did something I couldn't take back. He said it plainly. I was close. She looked at him. He was furious. She could see the full scope of it in him. And he was also, underneath the fury, something else. Shaken, maybe. Not by Whitmore, but by the room full of men who had listened and nodded, and not said the thing that needed saying. How many were there, she asked. 8, maybe 10. Did anyone object? He paused. Aldrich's son, young Tom. He said it wasn't any of their business how a private man ran his household. A beat. Whitmore told him to sit down, but he said it. Yes. She nodded. She went back to the garden fence and picked up the watering can and finished the row of beans she'd been on. Caleb stood in the yard and watched her with that look of someone who cannot understand how another person is still doing ordinary things. Mabel. His voice had changed, dropped. I need to ask you something. Ask it. Do you want to leave? Is this what you were afraid of when we made the arrangement? Because I'll make sure you're provided for. No. She said it before he'd finished, which was unlike her. She finished the row and turned around. He was still in the yard. The afternoon sun was behind him, and she had to shade her eyes with her hand to look at him properly. No, I don't want to leave. Even with. She lowered her hand. I built this garden. Ivy's eating and gaining weight and looking at you like you hung the sun. The chickens are laying, and the fence is holding, and the pantry is stocked, and I know exactly where everything in this kitchen is and why. I'm not leaving because Gerald Whitmore has opinions. Something in his posture released. Not all the way he was not a man who released things all the way but enough. He picked up the last supply box and carried it to the porch. Good, as he said, that was all. Just that, and then the work of the afternoon. But that night, after Ivy was down, and the kitchen was clean, and the lamp on the table burned low, he sat across from her with his coffee and said, I want to talk about what happens when Ivy doesn't need what you're providing anymore. She had been expecting this conversation. She'd been expecting it for weeks and had prepared for it in the way she prepared for most things she didn't want to happen by deciding in advance what her position was and how she'd hold it without falling apart. She'll need feeding for another few months, she said. After that, she moves too. That's not what I mean. He set his cup down. I mean, your position here. What it is. What it continues to be. After the original reason for it is no longer the reason. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to leave, he said. I'm asking the opposite. I'm asking whether you'd consider I'm trying to say something, and I'm not doing it well. You're doing fine. I'm not. He put both hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was being deliberate. I would like you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement. I would like you to stay as I want to ask whether you'd consider marrying me. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood that grew at the corner of the house. Somewhere out in the dark, a cow shifted and settled. Ivy breathed in the next room with the steady rhythm of a child who had figured out how to sleep and intended to do it fully. You don't have to do this out of obligation, Mabel said. Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it steady. This is about what Whitmore said, or about making the arrangement. It isn't. He said it with a directness that had no room in it. I have been watching you for 3 months. I have watched you fix things that were broken and grow things from ground that had been sitting untended and feed my daughter back to health, and run this household with more intelligence and more competence than anyone I have ever known. I have watched you take what people say about you and carry it without letting it make you less. And I have. He stopped. Something crossed his face that was harder to control than he wanted it to be. I have tried to be appropriate about it, about how I feel about it, about how I feel about you, and I am finished being appropriate about it. She looked at him for a long time. I'm not easy, she said. It was the truest thing she could offer. I don't mean who I am. I have specific ways I need things to be. I keep accounts in my head that most people don't notice me keeping. I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I know. You've seen me at this table at midnight working figures because I can't sleep and I don't know how to stop when my mind is going. You've seen me ugly with grief on the days it comes up without warning. You've seen me in an argument with a chicken. The corner of his mouth moved. The chicken had it coming. Caleb, he held her gaze. I know who you are. That's the whole of why I'm asking. She looked down at the table. She looked at her hands, which were not small or soft, or the hands that women in this county considered properly feminine. They were the hands of someone who had worked hard for a long time and had the evidence of it written into them. She had spent a year being ashamed of those hands, among other things. She was suddenly very tired of being ashamed. "All right," she said. He blinked. All right meaning yes." She looked up. "I'll marry you." He sat very still for a moment, and then he nodded once, slowly, with the expression of a man absorbing something he'd wanted and had not been fully certain he'd get. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "It's not a favor." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She had hoped, foolishly, that getting quietly married would be a way of managing the situation without making it a larger event than it needed to be. She had imagined something practical: the magistrate in Harlan Creek, 2 witnesses, a document signed, the thing done. What she had not accounted for was the town's relationship to the idea of the event even before the event occurred. The news traveled faster than she could have predicted. Ruth Cobb heard within the week. Mabel had written to her directly, and Ruth's response was so warm that Mabel read it twice and then put it in the writing desk drawer where she kept the things she wanted to not lose. Agnes Fowler stopped her at the market the following Tuesday and took her hand and said quietly, "Good, I'm glad," and that was all. And it was enough. What was not enough, from the other direction, was Dorothy Haynes. Dorothy arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, in the middle of July, which Mabel did not find out until she heard the wagon from the garden and came around the house to find Dorothy already dismounted and standing in the yard with the particular posture of someone who has prepared remarks. Caleb was not home. He was at the south pasture, which Dorothy very likely knew, because Dorothy was not a woman who acted without considering her timing. Mabel came to the yard fence with dirt on her apron and ivy on her hip and waited. "I wanted to speak to you directly," Dorothy said. She had her best going-out dress on, which meant this was a formal call in her estimation. Woman to woman. "All right," Mabel said. "What you're doing is I want to be clear that I understand your circumstances. You have had a genuinely difficult time, and I bear you no personal ill will." "That's generous," Mabel said, without inflection. Dorothy's composure thinned slightly at the edges. "What I'm trying to say is that there are better ways this could be handled. If you were to speak to Reverend Marsh, if the arrangement were acknowledged as temporary, and you were found a more suitable." "Dorothy." Mabel shifted ivy to her other hip. "What is it you've actually come here to say?" A pause. Dorothy squared her shoulders. "That this marriage will not go well for you. That this town will not receive it well. That Caleb Mercer is a man with standing here and you are." She stopped. "Fat widow," Mabel said pleasantly, "with no family and a dead child and a body that is available for commentary. Is that where you were going?" Dorothy's face went through several things in quick succession. "I'm trying to help you." "No, you're not." Mabel said it without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. "You came out here because you want me to understand that I don't belong here, and that this marriage makes you uncomfortable, and that you have the power to make my life difficult, and you want me to know it. Those are the actual things you came to say. I've heard them." She shifted ivy again. The baby had been watching Dorothy with the wide-eyed, solemn attention of an infant observing something outside her ordinary experience. "Now I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the same way I heard you, which is completely." Dorothy waited. "I have been uncomfortable for the last year and a half," Mabel said. "I have been uncomfortable in your dining room, and uncomfortable at your market, and uncomfortable in every room where women like you decided I was a subject for their opinions. I have survived all of that. I have come out on the other side of it with a garden that is producing and a household that runs, and a child who is healthy, and a man who has decided I am worth marrying. Not despite what I am." Because of it, she held Dorothy's gaze. "So I want you to ask yourself, very honestly, whether you have the energy for whatever comes next. Because I do." Dorothy said nothing for a long moment. "The wedding is the second Saturday in August," Mabel added. "If you decide to come, bring something practical. We don't need decorative things." She turned and went back into the house. Her heart was hammering. She waited until Kitchen's door was closed and then, stood with her back against it, and let it hammer for a full minute before she got herself under control. Ivy, still on her hip, looked up at her with those dark eyes and made a small interrogative sound. "We're all right," Mabel told her. "We're all right." She listened for the sound of Dorothy's wagon leaving. Came after a long pause, longer than expected, which meant Dorothy had stood in the yard for a while before deciding, and then the wheels on the packed dirt, and then nothing. Mabel went back to the garden. Ruth Cobb came 2 days before the wedding and stayed through it, which meant the house was briefly full, in a way it hadn't been since Mabel had arrived, and she found she didn't mind. Ruth slept in the kitchen room and was awake before anyone else each morning, and had opinions about everything from the state of the pantry to the positioning of the wedding itself, which was to be held in the yard, because the house was too small, and because Mabel refused to hold it at the church. "The yard is fine," Ruth said, surveying it on the Friday. "You'll want to clear that near fence of the morning glory. It's gotten out of hand." "I know," Mabel said. "I've been meaning to do it. Do it today. Tomorrow you've got other things." Ruth looked at her with those sharp eyes. "You look tired." "I am tired, nervous." "I don't get nervous." Ruth's eyebrows moved. "Mabel." "I'm nervous," Mabel said. "Don't make anything of it." Ruth made nothing of it, except to hand her the coffee cup she'd been holding and take Eye from her arms for the morning. The morning glory came out of the fence in a long, satisfying pull, root and all, and by afternoon the yard looked the way a yard should when something is about to happen in it. Danny Foss, who turned out to have more social utility than Mabel had credited him with, had quietly let it be known around the ranching community what was happening. And on the Saturday morning, there were more people in the Mercer yard than she had expected, not the town's women's auxiliary or the feed store men or anyone from Dorothy's circle, but ranching families from up and down the Sweetwater Road, people Caleb had known for years, people who had their own complicated histories with the county's account's opinion of things, and who had not needed to be talked into coming. Agnes Fowler was there, which Mabel had hoped for. Young Tom Aldrich was there, which she had not expected, and which meant something about what a person's was willing to spend their standing on. The magistrate was a small, efficient man named Harrison, who handled the ceremony with the brisk clarity of someone who has done this many times and has decided that clear and brief is more respectful than elaborate. Caleb stood next to her in the yard with the sun coming down on both of them and said the words he was supposed to say with the same direct quality he brought to every important thing not decorated, not performed, just said. When it was Mabel's turn, she looked at him. At his face, which was not a handsome face exactly, but was a face she had come to know well the particular set of it when he was containing something. The way the corner of his mouth moved before he was going to say something honest, the expression he had watching Ivy. She looked at all of that and said the words. When it was done, Harrison said the last thing and closed his book, and Caleb turned to her and put his hand on her face, just one hand, on the side of her face, and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, and the gesture was so careful and so deliberate and so entirely like him that her throat went tight in a way she hadn't prepared for. Ruth Cobb was holding Ivy at the edge of the gathered people, and Ivy, who had been watching the ceremony with her characteristic, serious attention, chose this moment to produce an extremely loud and satisfied sound that made several people laugh, including Mabel, which broke the tightness in her throat into something else. Agnes Fowler said, somewhere behind her, "There's a child who approves." The afternoon unwound in the ordinary human way of such occasions. Food appeared, people talked. Someone produced a fiddle and played 3 songs that were recognizable without being requested. Caleb stayed close to her without performing it, which she appreciated. He had his hand at her back or her arm, at intervals, not possessively, but in the way people touch what they have decided is theirs to care for. And each time she felt it, she had to make a deliberate adjustment to the understanding of what her life currently was. She was not good at being cared for. She had significant experience being the one who did the caring, and very little on the other side of it. She was going to have to practice. Late in the afternoon, when the gathering had thinned and Danny was cleaning up the yard and Ruth was inside putting Ivy down for her nap. Mabel stood at the garden fence and looked at what she'd grown, and felt the strange accumulated weight of the year behind her, the rented room, and the bread basket in the dirt, and Clara in the frozen ground, and the market, and the 12-mile wagon ride, and the first day in this kitchen and Ivy's hand unclenching. All of it, the full length of it, laid out. Caleb came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered lying or deflecting, or giving him the practical version. Then she said, "I'm thinking about all the times someone decided who I was before I could tell them." He was quiet. "Dorothy, Whitmore, the market, every room I've walked into for the last year." She looked at the potato rows, which were producing well, which she had grown from ground that had been left to go to ruin. "Keep waiting for the part where I believe it." "Believe what?" "That I'm allowed to be here. That this is actually mine." Turned and looked at her. "Is that still in question?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than it was," she said. Her hand. He did it the same way. He did everything, without announcement. Just the decision, and then the doing of it, and stood with her at the garden fence in the late afternoon of the day she'd married him, and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. The garden went on in its rows in front of them, green and real and grown by her hands, and it did not ask her to justify herself, and neither did he, and she held on to that, and let herself, finally and carefully, start to believe it. The morning after the wedding, Mabel woke before dawn the same as always. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar quality of the room, her room now, properly. Not the small space off the kitchen, but the main bedroom with its 2 east windows, and the wardrobe that smelled of cedar and something else, something that was Caleb, and the years of his life before she arrived and listened to the ranch, Locans wake up around her. Cattle, the wind in the cottonwood, a rooster that had been inconsistent about his timing all summer and had apparently decided this morning to be early. Caleb was asleep beside her. He slept with the absolute stillness of someone who works hard enough that sleep is not optional. And she lay there for a moment and looked at the side of his face in the dark and thought, with the particular clarity that comes. At 4 a.m, this is real. This is what real looks like. Then she got up, because the morning wasn't going to start itself. She lit the stove and put the coffee on and went to check on Ivy, who was asleep in the small room that had originally been Mabel's, the room off the kitchen, with its single window and its plain furniture, and which was now becoming, gradually and somewhat chaotically, a baby's room. Ivy slept on her back, with both arms thrown wide in the posture of someone who has decided to take up as much space as available, which was a thing she had been doing for approximately 3 weeks, and which Mabel found, every time, quietly hilarious. She stood in the doorway and watched her breathe and felt the familiar compound sensation, part wonder, part grief, part something she had no exact word for, the feeling of loving something that isn't yours and is yours, simultaneously. Ivy was not her daughter. She had never tried to tell herself otherwise. She was also in every way that the daily work of caring constitutes a claim, hers. Both things were true. She had made her peace with the bothness of it. The coffee was ready by the time Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, hat in hand. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept enough." She poured his cup and set it on the table. The south fence near the creek needs checking after last week's rain. The ground's soft, and that corner post has been questionable since spring. He sat down and looked at her over the cup. "It's the morning after our wedding." "The fence doesn't know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." She sat across from him with her own coffee, and they were quiet together in the way they had been quiet together for 5 months. Not the quiet of people with nothing to say, quiet of people who have said enough to trust the silences between words. It was one of the things she had not expected about marrying him. How much of what mattered between them had always happened in the space around the talking. Outside, the dawn was beginning in the way of high plains dawns, not a gentle thing, not a gradual sweetening of the dark, was a sudden line of light along the eastern horizon that hardened quickly into morning, as though the land didn't have patience for transitions. Mabel had come to love that quality of the place. It was honest. It didn't pretend the dark was going to last any longer than it was. What the town did in the weeks following the wedding was not quite what she'd prepared for, and that lack of preparation turned out to matter. She had prepared for hostility for Dorothy's circle to be louder, for Whitmore to press harder on the ranchers, for the market to get worse before it got better. She had her arguments ready. She had her posture and her steadiness and her prices and her bread. She had thought. She knew the shape of what was coming. What came instead was more complicated than simple hostility because it was mixed. The hostility was there, it didn't disappear, and she would have been a fool to expect it to. But alongside it was something she hadn't counted on. A gradual, grudging, inconsistent shift in a portion of the town that had apparently been watching and had reached a different conclusion than Dorothy. Young Tom Aldrich was part of it. He had come to the wedding, and his father had found out, and there had been, by all accounts, a significant argument in the Aldrich household about the difference between community standards and a man's private affairs. Tom had apparently held his ground because he continued to nod to Mabel at the market with the deliberate acknowledgement of someone making a point they intend to keep making. Mrs. Briggs, the wife of the land surveyor, stopped to buy bread one Tuesday and stayed to talk for 10 minutes about her kitchen garden, asking specific questions about turnip varieties with the practical focus of a woman who wanted information and had decided to get it from wherever it was available, regardless of Dorothy Haynes's opinion on the source. She came back the following Thursday and bought 2 loaves and said, in passing, that she'd heard the Mercer Ranch had come a long way in the last few months. It was not an apology, and it was not a full change of position, but it was something. Agnes Fowler, who had never been on Dorothy's side to begin with, became more openly supportive in the particular way. Agnes did things not with speeches or declarations, with a steady constancy of someone who shows up the same way every time until the showing up itself becomes the statement. Dorothy, for her part, went quiet in a way that was different from her previous silences. This was not the quiet of a woman preparing her next move. It was, Mabel eventually decided, the quiet of a woman who had made a calculation and found that the return wasn't what she'd expected. The town had not uniformly followed her lead. Some of it had, some of it hadn't. And Dorothy was above all else a woman who tracked outcomes. She did not come to the ranch again. She did not stop her opinions entirely. Mabel heard things at intervals through the ordinary channels by which small towns transmit their judgments. The organized pressure of it, the letter writing, and the deliberate campaign of it went quiet. Mabel did not make the mistake of calling it a victory. It wasn't. It was a pause, and pauses ended. What it gave her was time. Time to consolidate, to build the things that needed building, to establish the ranch's presence in the county in ways that had nothing to do with opinion and everything to do with outcome. She had always understood that the most durable argument she could make for her own worth was not an argument at all. It was the evidence. The evidence, by September, was considerable. Kitchen Garden had produced beyond what she'd projected in the spring. The root cellars she had found an old one behind the barn that Caleb hadn't known was still usable, and had spent 3 days in July cleaning it out and reinforcing. The walls were stocked with enough to carry them well into winter. The potato harvest alone was substantial enough that she'd sold a portion at market, which was how she came to be known by certain of the ranching families along the Sweetwater Road as a woman who knew what she was doing with land. That reputation traveled in the specific, useful way that practical reputations travel not through endorsement or announcement, but through the question one woman asks another when she wants to know where to get something done. She had also, with Danny Foss's help and Caleb's involvement on the heavier work, rebuilt the section of the barn roof that had been poorly patched the previous winter and was not going to survive another one. That had taken A week of September and several arguments about the correct method, one of which she'd won, and one of which she'd conceded when Caleb demonstrated on an actual beam that he was right, and she'd been working from a principle that didn't apply to this specific roof structure. She had conceded it directly and without lingering, because being wrong was not, in her estimation, a thing that required elaborate navigation. You were wrong. You said so. You did the right thing. He had looked at her when she said it, just looked, briefly, and she knew she'd surprised him. She thought he'd been waiting for the argument to continue past where the evidence ended, the way arguments sometimes did when they were about something other than the thing they were nominally about. She hadn't done that. She didn't see the point. "How did you know about roof joints?" he asked, after, when they were cleaning up. "Thomas. He built things and talked about what he was doing while he built them. I listened." "You didn't build things with him?" "Sometimes. Mostly I listened. He was better at the talking while working than most." She gathered at the sks of old roofing. "He was a good man. Not a complicated one." "Good." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss him?" She thought about it honestly. "I miss the life I thought I was going to have," she said. "The specific version of the future I'd planned around him. That's a different thing from missing him, though it looks the same from the outside." "Does it feel different on the inside?" "Yes." She stopped and looked at him. "I'm not carrying grief about Thomas into this, if that's what you're asking. What I had with him was real, and it's over, and this is different and separate. Doesn't compete." He nodded. He'd needed to hear it said plainly, she could tell. He wasn't a man who asked for reassurance often, but when he needed it in words, not in inference. She had learned that. She was still learning it. "What about you?" she said. Ivy's mother. "Do yes," he said simply. "I do?" "I know. Does that—" "No," she said. "Same principle." He let out a breath. "We're both carrying dead people," he said, with a flatness that was not callousness, but was the particular pragmatism of people who have done real grieving and come out on the other side of it still standing. "Most people our age are," she said. "It's not a problem unless we let it be one." She went back to gathering the scraps. He went back to the lab the roof held that winter, and the two after it, which was what roofs were supposed to do. Question of Clara came up in October, and Mabel was the one who raised it. She had been to the market on a Tuesday, a better market than most. 3 new families, having settled in the area, who didn't have the town's established opinions about her, and simply bought bread from the woman who sold bread, and, on the way back, she stopped at the cemetery. She did this alone, on market days, when she could make it fit in the route, without it being a thing she had to explain to anyone. The grave was small and simply marked. She had paid for the stone herself, out of the bread money, in February. Clara Carter, January 1873. That was all there was to say that fit on a stone. The rest of it didn't fit anywhere. She stood there for perhaps 10 minutes. The cemetery was empty that afternoon. The wind came through it from the north, rattling the dry grass along the fence line, and she was alone with the particular quality of that silence, which was not peaceful exactly, but was honest in a way she found she needed at intervals. She had been thinking about what to do with this. The question of whether to tell Caleb the full shape of it, not just the fact of Clara, which he knew, but the ongoing texture of it, the way it still moved in her at unexpected moments. She had been protective of that. It was hers, and she had kept it carefully separate from everything else, because she had been afraid that sharing it would make her seem like a woman living in her grief instead of through it. She had said to him, "I'm not carrying grief into this," and she'd meant it as reassurance, and it was also, she had come to understand, not entirely true. Carried it. You always carried it. The question was whether you were honest about the carrying. She told him that evening. Not as a confession, not with ceremony just after supper. When Ivy was down and the lamp was burning low, she said, "I stop at Clara's grave on market days. On the way back, I've been doing it since before I came out here, and I've kept doing it. I wanted you to know." He looked at her across the table. "All right," he said. "It's not that I'm not present here, or that I'm Mabel. He said it quietly. You don't have to justify that. I know. She looked at her hands. I wanted you to know because it's part of how I am and I'd been keeping it separate and I don't want to do that anymore. Keep things separate from you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I come with you sometime? She looked up. Not every time, he said. If you want to go alone, go alone. Sometime. She thought about it. She thought about what it would mean to have him there, not as witness or support, or any performed version of either, just there. The way he was there for things that mattered. Yes, she said. Sometime. He came the following Tuesday. He stood beside her at the small stone and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. He'd brought nothing and said nothing and done nothing, except stand there with his hat in his hands. And after a few minutes, she reached over and took his hand, which she hadn't planned to do, and they stood like that for a while, with the November wind coming through the cemetery fence. On the way home, she said, Thank you. For what? For not saying anything. I didn't know what to say. That's why it was right. He squeezed her hand once, briefly, before he needed both hands for the reins, and she looked out at the winter grass going on toward the horizon and felt something in the accumulated weight of the year shift, slightly not lift, not disappear, but shift the way a load shifts when someone takes some of the balance. Gerald Whitmore made his final attempt in November, and he did it through property. There was a parcel of land on the western edge of Caleb's range, 20 acres of good grass that had been in informal use by the Mercer cattle for 3 years, without a formal claim, because the original owner had moved east in 1870, and the title had been unclear since. Whitmore filed a claim on it, not because he needed 20 acres of mixed grass, because he could, and because it would cut access to the western creek in dry months, and because it was the kind of move that said, I have not forgotten, and I have more resources than you, and I can make things difficult without ever saying your wife's name again. Caleb found out on a Wednesday from the county recorder's office and came home with the flat, controlled expression that Mabel had come to recognize as his version of fury fully managed. She read the filing notice he brought home. She read it twice. He filed 3 weeks ago. She said, Yes, and the recorder's office notified you now. There was apparently a clerical delay. His voice was exactly level. She set the paper down. She thought for a moment. Is the original title genuinely unclear? The lawyer in town thinks so. It's been unclaimed long enough that there's an argument either way. What does the lawyer think it would cost to contest it? He told her. It was more than they had liquid, and they both knew it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. She had been doing figures in her head since the fall, the garden income, the market money, the money she'd been setting aside in the small account she'd maintained, since before she came to the ranch, the amounts that were accumulating in ways she hadn't yet fully reported to Caleb because she hadn't decided what to do with them. She reported them now, plainly sitting across the kitchen table. He looked at her. You've had that set aside. Since before. Old habit. She met his eyes. It's enough to cover the legal costs if we're careful about the rest of winter. That's your money. I'm your wife, she said. It's our money. The same way the ranch is our ranch and the garden is our garden. She paused. Do you want to contest it or not? He looked at the filing notice. Yes. Then we contest it. She wrote to the lawyer herself that evening, with the specificity of someone who has dealt with documents before and knows that clarity in writing is a form of power. She laid out what they knew, what they could demonstrate, what the usage record of the land was, and how it could be established, and she asked 3 precise questions about the evidentiary threshold. The lawyer wrote back impressed, which he said, and which Caleb read over her shoulder and said nothing about, but she felt him smile. Contest took 2 months and 3 hearings before the county land commissioner, and Mabel attended all 3. She sat beside Caleb in the commissioner's office and did not perform anything, did not perform composure or confidence or the particular brand of femininity that might have made certain men in that room more comfortable. And when the commissioner asked a question, she answered it directly. And when Whitmore's lawyer made an argument she knew was wrong, She wrote a note to their lawyer on the paper in front of her, and the note turned out to be the correct counter which their lawyer used, which worked. Whitmore was in the room for the second hearing. He looked at her once, across the small office with the expression of a man recalibrating. She held his gaze until he looked away. She didn't do it aggressively. She wasn't performing that either. She simply didn't look away because she had decided she was done being the one who looked away first. The claim was denied in January. The 20 acres remained in informal Mercer use, with a provisional arrangement that the land commissioner recommended be formalized. They did through the proper channels that spring with a small filing fee and a document that Mabel kept in the writing desk with the other things she didn't want to lose. Whitmore did not attempt anything further after that. Whether this was because he'd run the calculation and found the return insufficient, or because he'd looked at her across that room and revised his assessment of the situation, she didn't know. She didn't need to know. He was simply no longer in the story, and that was enough. Dorothy Haynes came to the market one Thursday in February and bought bread. She came to Mabel's table, specifically, not by accident. The table was at the same end of the row it had always been, and you had to make a choice to go there. And she stood on the other side of the cloth and looked at what was available with the careful attention of someone who is deciding something more than bread. She bought 2 loaves. She paid the correct price without discussion. She was about to leave when she stopped, and Mabel waited, because Dorothy was clearly working up to something. The bread was always good, Dorothy said. She said it to the loaves, not quite to Mabel. I want you to know I was aware of that. It was possibly the strangest form of apology Mabel had ever received. It was not an apology. It was the outer edge of one, the furthest Dorothy could get from her own position without actually crossing into regret, a careful half step that cost something and offered almost nothing and was, coming from this particular woman, more than Mabel had expected. She thought about what to do with it. She could let it land and not respond, which would be accurate but not generous. She could say something pointed, which she had every right to, and which would be satisfying for approximately 40 seconds. Or she could decide that a half step was still a step, and that the people who didn't take them were worse than the people who only got halfway. Thank you, Dorothy, she said. That was all. Dorothy nodded and left with her loaves, and Mabel sold the rest of her bread and drove home through the February cold, and didn't think about it any further that day. Some things didn't need to be thought about further, just needed to be finished. Ivy began walking in March, which was earlier than expected and considerably more dramatic than anticipated. She had been showing signs for weeks, pulling herself up on furniture, standing with the focused intensity of someone solving a problem, taking one experimental step and then sitting down hard and looking at the floor with an expression of deep consideration. Mabel and Caleb had been watching this process with the particular attention of people who know something is about to happen and are waiting for it without wanting to rush it. It happened on a Tuesday morning while Mabel was at the market. Caleb reported it that evening in the way he reported things directly, and with a suppressed quality to his voice that she had learned to recognize as him containing emotion he wasn't going to perform for anyone. He said that Ivy had pulled herself up on the kitchen table leg, stood for a moment, and then walked 4 steps toward the window before sitting down, and that he had been alone in the kitchen and had no one to tell. Mabel listened to this. She looked at him. She could see what it had cost him, being alone in the kitchen when that happened, not because she wasn't there, but because there had been no one to turn to and say, "Did you see that? Did you see it?" Which is the specific human need of a good moment, the need to make it real by sharing it. "Tell me again," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me what it looked like," she said, "from the beginning, what she was doing before." And he did. He described it with a precision and a care she hadn't heard from him before, the way Ivy had been holding the table leg, the particular expression of concentration on her face, the quality of those 4 steps, the way she'd sat down after, as though she'd done something she'd needed to do and was now satisfied. Described it for perhaps 5 minutes, and while he talked, the suppressed quality in his voice gradually released, and by the end of it, he was simply talking the way a man talks about something that mattered to him, without containment. She was aware, listening to him, of several things simultaneously, that she was glad she had been the one he told, and that she was sad to have missed it, and that both of those things could be true at once, and that this was, in the plain arithmetic of it, what a life that you share with someone is made of the things you witness together and the things you only witness through each other, the gaps and the fillings of gaps. Ordinary accumulation of moments that are unremarkable until you look back and see that they were everything. She had been trying to understand for the better part of a year what she had been so afraid of. When she had stood at her bread table in the cold market and felt the edges of her life contracting around her. When she had lain in the rented room and looked at the orange rectangle of light on the wall and felt the silence of a life that had stopped making room for her. She had named it as loneliness, as grief, as the consequence of loss. All of those were true. But underneath them was something simpler and harder to say. She had been afraid that she was the kind of person the world was right about, that the verdict being delivered in 100 small daily ways was the accurate one, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, too large in body, and too diminished in every other sense to merit being seen as she actually was. She knew now that she had been wrong. Not because the world had changed its verdict, parts of it never would, and she had made her peace with that more or less, but because the verdict was wrong, and she had finally accumulated enough evidence to know it in her bones rather than just in her head. The garden that she'd grown from dead ground, the baby who had lived, the husband who described 4 small steps with the careful attention of a man who needed someone to tell, bread that was always good, even when no one was willing to say so. She was not a different person than the woman who had stood in the cold market with her bread basket in the dirt. She was the same person. The circumstances had changed, but she hadn't not in the ways that mattered. She had always been the woman who fixed the thing that was broken and grew the thing that was needed and stayed when staying was the harder choice. She'd just been standing in rooms where no one was looking at that. Now she was standing somewhere that was hers, not given to her, not assigned. Built with her own hands, from the ground up, out of everything she had. Ivy walked for the first time, properly for Mabel, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the kitchen, with the spring light coming through the west windows. She did it with the full theatrical commitment she brought to. Most things stood up from beside the rocker, fixed Mabel with the concentrated dark-eyed stare, and then walked across the kitchen floor with a kind of purposeful wavering, like a ship that is going where it means to go, while the water does its best to interfere, and grabbed the edge of Mabel's apron and stood there. Mabel crouched down, her knees still ached. They always would, and looked at Ivy's face, which was wearing an expression of absolute triumph. "I see you," Mabel said. Ivy made a sound that was not yet a word, and would not be for another few months, but that had the cadence and the confidence of something that would become one. Then she let go of the apron and walked back to the rocker, sat down with a thud, and appeared to consider the matter concluded. Mabel stayed crouched for a moment after the baby had moved away. Her throat was doing what it did. She let it do it, briefly, and then stood up and went back to the dough she'd been working. Caleb was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "Did you see that?" she asked. "Yes." His voice had the same quality it had had the night before when he'd described it, that particular fullness. "Did it for you." She did it because she wanted to get across the kitchen. "She did it for you," he said again. He came in and sat at the table. "She knows what she's doing, that child. She's 10 months old. I know how old she is." He reached for the coffee cup, found it empty, and got up to refill it from the pot. "She knew you hadn't seen it, somehow she knew." Mabel didn't argue with this. She didn't entirely disbelieve it. Ivy was a person with opinions and intentions, and she had made that clear from approximately week 8, and there was no particular reason to think she had become less so. "Caleb," she said. What, I'm happy. She said it the same way she said most important things plainly, without decoration, as a statement of fact. I want you to know that. Not content, not managing. Happy. He stood at the stove with his coffee and looked at her for a moment. So am I, he said. Good. She went back to the dough. The east fence is going to need work before summer. The corner posts are heaving from the freeze-thaw, and if we don't set them properly, we'll lose the whole section. He sat back down. I was thinking we could get to it beginning of April. You don't want to be chasing cattle in June because you waited on a fence. Beginning of April, he agreed. The kitchen was warm. Ivy was practicing standing up and sitting down in the corner with the methodical focus of someone who has identified a skill and intends to master it. The dough was coming together, the way good dough does, resistant at first, and then suddenly yielding, the whole texture changing under her hands. She had spent a long time being a woman who endured things, who got up and kept going because there was no other option and because falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had survived her husband's death and her daughter's death and the year of bread in the cold and the market and the boarding house and all the rooms full of people who looked at her and saw only the surface of her. Enduring was not nothing. Enduring was what kept you alive long enough for the other thing to arrive. But enduring was not the whole of a life, and she had not known until this year, not really, not in the bone-level way, that changes how you carry yourself, that she was allowed to want more than survival, that she was allowed to build instead of just withstand, that the life she was capable of was larger than the one she'd been assigned by the narrowness of other people's sight. Thought about the woman at the market with the bread basket in the dirt. She thought about what she would say to that woman. If she could, she would not tell her it was going to be fine. She would not promise the ranch or Caleb or Ivy or the garden in the spring, because those were specific outcomes, and the world was not in the business of guaranteeing specific outcomes to anyone. She would not tell her that the town was going to come around or that the people who looked through her were going to one day see her clearly, because some of them wouldn't. What she would tell her was this: pick up the bread, not because it fixes anything, but because the picking up is who you are. And who you are is worth more than what they're doing to it right now. Keep going, not because it gets easier, but because you are the kind of person who can go harder than easy. And somewhere down the 12 miles of bad road, there is a kitchen with a garden outside it, and a baby who walks toward you on purpose, and none of that is a reward for enduring. Just what life can be when you stop letting the wrong people decide what you're worth. Put the bread back on the table. Sell it to the people who know good bread when they have it. And don't look up to see if anyone's watching. You know what you are. Start there. The summer that followed was not easy. Nothing on a working ranch in that country, and that era was easy, and Mabel had learned enough by then to stop expecting easy and start expecting real. East Fence did heave, and they did get to it in early April, and it still cost them a week and 3 broken posts. And one afternoon, when everything went wrong simultaneously, and Caleb said something sharp, and she said something sharper back, and they worked the rest of the day in the specific charged silence of 2 people who have had a real argument and haven't finished it yet. They finished it that evening, over the table, with the directness they had both learned to use with each other. He said what he'd actually meant. She said what she'd actually meant. They were not the same things as what they'd said during the fence work. The fence work argument had been about the fence. The evening argument was about the thing underneath the fence, which was fear his, about the summer pasture water, which was lower than it should have been for May, hers, about money, about whether the winter reserves had been sufficient, about the specific anxiety of a woman who grew up watching a family almost not make it and had never entirely unlearned the vigilance of that. They sat with both fears on the table between them. They didn't resolve them completely, because some fears aren't resolved, they're just carried more honestly. They went to bed that night, having said the true things, which was worth more than false comfort. The summer pasture water came up in June, when the snowmelt hit the creek system properly, and the summer was hard but survivable, and the fall harvest was the best the ranch had seen in 5 years. And Danny Foss turned out to have a genuine aptitude for cattle management that neither Mabel nor Caleb had fully recognized under Pete's shadow, and by autumn they had the land commissioner's formal title to the 20 western acres, and a root cellar so well stocked that Mabel stood in it one October afternoon and felt for a moment, specifically and completely, the satisfaction of a thing properly done. She stood there for a while. She let herself feel it without immediately moving to the next tasks. That was new. She was practicing it. She was not naturally given to resting. Inside a good moment, her instinct was always to be already planning the next necessary thing. And Caleb had said to her once, gently, that he sometimes felt like the moment he put something down, she had already moved past it, and that it would mean something to him if she could stay in things a little longer. She had heard that as the real thing it was, and had been working on it since. She stayed in the root cellar for 5 minutes. She looked at the stored potatoes, the jars of preserved vegetables, the cured meat on the upper shelves, the careful, organized evidence of a household that knew how to sustain itself. Then she went back to the kitchen. Ivy was at the table with a piece of cornbread, eating it with the industrious focus of a 1-year-old who has opinions about cornbread. She looked up when Mabel came in and said something that was almost a word, and was definitely a greeting. "Hello," Mabel said. She sat down across from her. "How's the cornbread?" Ivy offered her a piece. "Thank you," Mabel said, and took it. There are lives that announce themselves that arrive with ceremony and justification, and the approval of the rooms that matter. Mabel Carter's life had not been that kind. It had arrived quietly, incrementally, through work and loss, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to accept that the assessment of her value by people who could not see past her surface was the final word on the subject. She had not been saved. She had not been rescued. She had walked 12 miles of bad road in the cold, on her own terms, and built something at the end of it with her own hands. Caleb had offered the ground. She had made it fertile. Ivy had given her a reason to stay long enough to believe it. This is what nobody tells you about worth. It doesn't come from being recognized. Recognition is nice. Recognition matters, but it is not the root of the thing. The root of the thing is that you keep going anyway. When the recognition hasn't arrived yet, when the room is still deciding about you, when your bread is in the dirt and your knees are cold and every woman who could have helped you has looked away, you keep going because the work itself tells you who you are if you're willing to listen to it. Mabel had listened. This was what she'd heard. You are the woman who fixed the coop and grew the potatoes and fed the baby that no one else would feed. You are the woman who drove yourself 12 miles on a bad road because you said you weren't giving up the market and you meant it. You are the woman who burned not with bitterness, but with the quiet, persistent fire of someone the quiet, persistent decided that her own account of herself is the one that matters. That was always who she was. She had just finally found the ground to stand on. The kitchen was warm. The afternoon light came through the west windows at that familiar low golden angle. Caleb's boots were on the porch, and his coffee cup was on the counter, and somewhere outside Danny Foss was doing something useful with a fence post, and Ivy was eating cornbread with perfect concentration, and the garden outside the window, stripped now for winter, would come back in the spring. It always came back. Mabel looked at all of it, the ordinary, specific, hard-won everything of it, and she did not look away.